Welcome to the discussion on organizational culture. Although organizational culture is a familiar concept in managerial language, most managers will likely lack a clear and distinct definition. To begin the discussion on organizational culture, we will use Noel Tisci's model. Tisci places organizational culture in a broader context, which is a good starting point. Later, we will narrow the focus and explore different aspects of the culture itself. Tisci divides the building blocks of the organization into three types, using the metaphor of states of matter. The rigid part of the organization is its structure. The foundations around which the various parts are built make it what it is, another metaphor. We are not just talking about the organizational structure, but everything under the operation category, such as job definitions, core processes, and procedures. Tisci says this is the organization in a solid state. It is the part of the organization that can be relatively easily grasped. Whether this operative model is written or a convention, it can be easily explained to an outsider. Water, unlike solids, is more elusive. It's hard to hold in your hand for long. Tisci uses it as a metaphor for the organization's interpersonal relationships and power dynamics, which are only partially visible. We can describe relationships between people and dynamics within groups and teams, but understanding and analyzing them is much harder. On the other hand, they can be influenced. It might not always be easy, but it is possible. Influence on relationships can be through so-called soft skills, after all, water, and job definitions, organizational structures, processes, and so on. Steam, unlike water, is not only hard to hold, but also hard to see. The air around us has moisture, water vapor. They are there and are essential in maintaining our bodies, but we can't always see them, and we certainly can't hold them. Tisci uses this metaphor to describe organizational culture. We all know it's necessary, but we don't understand what it is. Even more importantly, it's much less clear to us how to influence it, not to mention change it. Tisci's model can be misleading and create the illusion that the distinction between culture, relationships, and the operative model is sharp, and that there is a clear boundary where one part ends and another begins. The model might also confuse us into thinking there is a specific hierarchy between the states of matter, that the air is based on the water above the ice. The operative model is the foundation upon which relationships and organizational culture rely. Reality, as always, is more complex and complicated than any model. When we attempt to analyze and understand an organization, we must use language that includes operational concepts, elements of relationships and dynamics, as well as components of organizational culture. This point is particularly important within the discourse on leading changes. Often, when analyzing organizational problems to propose solutions, the analysis is done from one or at most two perspectives, so that one solution can address the entire issue, or at least most of it. As mentioned in the book's introduction, we are creatures that think in patterns. For every problem, we have a suitable drawer from which we can pull out a proven recipe based on experience. We have drawers for operational problems, drawers for interpersonal issues, and a drawer labeled organizational culture. We'll address the last drawer and what's in, or isn't it, in a moment. But first, let's say a few words about drawers. As stated, the reality is more complex than any model, and it is tough to lead significant transformative changes. This is the place to recall the distinction from the first chapter between a technical problem and an adaptive challenge. Using tools in a single drawer. This means that the operational model and organizational culture mutually influence each other. So it is only sometimes possible to say where one ends and the other begins. Therefore, when facing a significant organizational change process, using only one drawer would be a mistake. For example, if the organization wants to start using a certain reporting tool, a change that is seemingly technical in nature, it would be a very problematic assumption to think that all that is needed are clear process definitions, training, KPIs, and other operational elements to promote the adoption of the new tool within the organization. The introduction of a new tool may indeed include changes in organizational power relations, impact relationships between individuals and departments, shape narratives around what is essential and valued, and other soft elements. It would be naive to think that such an organizational change can be led solely through the operational toolbox in the first drawer. This is also why many such changes fail or succeed only after significant organizational and managerial energy investments. Therefore, leaders whose role is to lead changes must recognize organizational culture. Perhaps this is the context for Peter Drucker's timeless statement about culture, eating strategy for breakfast. No matter which direction the organization's strategy wants to move, the culture will drive it. Therefore, the success and prosperity of the organization are very much dependent on its organizational culture. In other words, according to Drucker, culture is the fuel that is more responsible than anything for the organization's movement. A better metaphor from the field of movement is the steering wheel. Culture is the thing that dictates the direction the organization will actually move in, regardless of what the person is sitting behind its plans. Honestly, even the steering wheel needs to be a better metaphor, because the driver can quickly turn the steering wheel and control the direction through it. The metaphor of an autonomous vehicle may be more appropriate. The driver sits in the vehicle and thinks of traveling a certain route, but the vehicle has autonomy and chooses its own routes. We can continue to explore the transportation metaphor of organizational culture and its incredible power compared to strategy, but the general idea is understood. The great power attributed to organizational culture, brilliantly articulated by Drucker, is widely accepted by the managerial community, to the point that many see it as an inevitable fate, a fact of life that cannot be changed. And the truth is, this stance is not unfounded at all. Organizational culture is indeed very difficult to change. We prefer to talk about it in terms of influence rather than change. To summarize so far, organizational culture appears to be important to managerial and organizational discourse for two reasons. It affects the organization's ability to thrive in the changing reality of life in the 21st century, and we face it with awe and wonder, often without having any idea what to do about it. Expansion on what was said in the meeting. One of the interesting questions is how organizational culture is formed and what shapes it. If we know the factors that create this elusive thing we call organizational culture, perhaps we can find ways to influence it. We can start from the external areas of the organization, such as the social field in which the organization operates. This begins with the country in which it is located. A European organization, for example, inherently has a different culture than a Chinese organization, and both are, of course, different from an Israeli organization. Those who have worked in global organizations are familiar with the presence of local culture within every site of the organization. Beyond the cultural gaps between different countries, there is also the gap between different fields. For instance, the culture of companies in the construction field is different from that of law firms, and both are different from that of tech companies. In other words, the professional arena also impacts the organization's culture. Moving on, let's examine the organization's activities. For example, there is a cultural difference between an organization that manufactures products, an organization that provides services, and an organization that executes projects. Thus, the cultural field in which the organization operates influences its culture. This is quite clear. However, it isn't sensible because we cannot affect the cultural field. What else influences organizational culture? The organization's history. Every organization has an organizational memory that encapsulates the important events, positive or negative, that shaped it. Crises that the organization has experienced can influence its perception of reality and shape the culture within it. This is an interesting point because, although it is challenging to influence history, thinking of historical events as culture shapers may shed light on how organizational culture evolves. To understand this point, one needs to be familiar with another concept: organizational equilibrium. Organizational equilibrium is when the organization expends minimal energy on changing. It is in stagnation. This means the organization has stabilized around a point where it can maximize its outputs without changing or adapting to the situation. Organizational equilibrium is the organization's comfort zone. It is comfortable not to change. It has gotten used to the situation. No surprises. The organization always strives to reach equilibrium. This is its tendency. Every time something shifts the organization out of equilibrium, it will strive to return there as quickly as possible. The organization develops defense mechanisms to prevent it from leaving equilibrium, and thus a very large amount of organizational energy is required to move it out of equilibrium. Sometimes, due to dramatic events, the organization distances itself enough from its equilibrium state. The organization can either disintegrate or reorganize around a new equilibrium point in such situations. This process happens spontaneously. The professional term is self-organization. The organization reorganizes itself independently, creating a new order and a new equilibrium point. In this process, the system stabilizes around perceptions and beliefs, habits, moods and patterns, and fixes them. This is how organizational culture crystallizes. What dramatic event can produce enough energy to move the organization out of equilibrium? One possibility could be a process of accumulating discontent, similar to the boiling frog mentioned in the first chapter. This discontent creates frustration and anger that may escalate to a crisis point, which can translate into energy that, if large enough, will move the organization out of its equilibrium. To accumulate enough energy, the pain associated with not changing needs to be much greater than the pain associated with changing. The second possibility reminds us of the turkey mentioned in the previous chapter, a short event that disrupts the system's equilibrium. This could be an external event, like COVID-19, an economic bubble burst, etc. An internal event, an unexpected replacement of a key figure like the founder, a sharp reduction in workforce, etc. Or a mix of internal and external, like a company acquisition or merger. As mentioned, the organization's self-organization around a new equilibrium point may change paradigms, perceptions, and behaviors that can pull the organizational culture in one direction or another. It is important to remember that self-organization, as the name implies, is self-driven. It is not controlled, and therefore its cultural outcomes are likewise. Next, we will present another, less radical way to influence organizational culture. One way to make organizational culture more tangible is to distinguish between its expression and source. Organizational culture is concretely expressed in the organization's daily reality through its accepted norms. Norms are behavioral patterns, meaning behaviors that are repeatedly exhibited by some members of the organization and are considered de facto standard. The emphasis on de facto is because, in many cases, the organization's formal statement opposes the standard. But whether by action or inaction, the organization accepts this standard. These norms are based on fundamental perceptions and basic beliefs through which the organization views reality. Like an iceberg, most of which is below the surface, hidden from view but strongly connected to what is above. When investigating organizational culture, it is helpful to identify the accepted norms and try to understand their underlying basis. The issue is that an organization's standards are not uniformly distributed, nor are the beliefs and fundamental perceptions. Therefore, it isn't easy to think of and reduce the organization to a single entity. We will tend to attribute responsibility for certain norms to specific individuals or groups within the organization. We recommend thinking of the organization as a person and asking what perceptions and beliefs might lead a person to such behaviors. For example, let's analyze an organization characterized by extreme tardiness, an organization with work plans that are even relatively well organized, but in practice, no one ever adheres to these plans. In casual conversations, it is clear to employees that they are not expected to meet the plans despite the management being very concerned with delays. When investigating this phenomenon a bit, it becomes clear that the norm in the organization is to set unachievable goals from the outset. The managerial perception behind this norm is that people exert effort in direct proportion to the goal set before them. If an aggressive target is set, they will push themselves more. This method is well known through the following algorithm. If we demand 100% from employees, we will get 70%, but if we require 150%, they will give 90%. Now let's ask what underlies this managerial perception. If the organization were a person, we could assume that it believes in this perception because it doesn't believe it can make employees, or people in general, put in more effort without manipulating them. And if we ask again, why would that person adopt such a belief about the world? One possible answer is that the person does not believe in their ability to influence, lead, and guide through trust and authenticity. Returning to the organization, the assumption is that its leadership, not the leader, does not believe in its own appeal. The connection between norms and the fundamental beliefs that lead to them is the key to influencing organizational culture. If we map out the organizational norms that express the culture and work to change those that require change, something interesting can happen. First, norms are less complicated to change because they are more tangible than airy concepts like culture or values. Second, if a dialogue connects norms to the fundamental beliefs that lead to them, then when a norm changes, it allows for questioning a fundamental belief, which can lead to a crack in that belief. This crack can widen as more norms change, making it easier to alter additional norms and so on. Therefore, we propose that you create a dialogue in the organization about norms and their connection to the beliefs that underpin them, while simultaneously taking baby steps to change some of those norms. When dealing with norms, it is essential to be aware of the laundry deception. Work procedures, a mechanism designed to regulate organizational activities, are also a laundry that cleans the way we operate and makes it easier for us to act according to codes we are uncomfortable admitting we follow. Consider the following situation. You give an important task to an employee, and after a few hours they tell you that another team wants to handle an urgent field issue for them. You check and see that the system does not have all the data on the problem filled out as the procedure requires. Which statement would you feel more comfortable saying to your employee? Think small. Right now, the problem is someone else's responsibility. Try to avoid it as much as possible and focus on the task I gave you. Or, there is a clear procedure on how to transfer the handling of a field issue between groups. Continue working on what I asked you until all the data is filled out according to the procedure. You would likely feel more comfortable with the second statement, even though the subtext is the same as the first. Since we cannot look our employees, and ourselves, in the eye and ask them to think small, we use the laundry, stick to the procedure. A norm-focused dialogue exposes the laundry deception. It forces us to examine what we say and do through the norms they represent. It makes us aware of the normative significance of our actions. It confronts us with a value gap we are uncomfortable with. When we shift to a norm-focused dialogue, we do not feel comfortable sticking to procedures that result from flawed norms. A change in organizational culture begins when we talk about norms instead of focusing on procedures. When talking about procedures, we ask how we will perform the work. When discussing norms, we ask what kind of people we want to be while working. When talking about procedures, the language is consequential. When talking about norms, the language is educational. When talking about procedures, the focus is on goals. When talking about norms, the focus is on relationships. For example, sexual harassment procedures are a classic example of a normative issue hidden behind a regulatory mechanism and procedures. In many organizations, this procedure is a dead letter lying in a file on the bulletin board with details of other organizational issues that most people do not know. The fact that there is a procedure allows for avoiding discussion about the norms that actually exist. The procedure turns the discussion binary. Either it is followed or not. It also releases the organization from having a discussion, which may indeed be difficult and unpleasant, about the character it wants to uphold regarding the spirit of the law on harassment. The entire organization submits to the procedure that launders reality and ostensibly addresses a deep-seated issue.